That's awesome. And we are live on the Gamification Revolution. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman. This lovely, lovely day, I'm coming to you from Toronto, Canada. And I'm here with my guest today, Jon Radoff, who's joining us from Framingham, not Boston. Hi, Jon.
Framingham, but it's close enough to Boston.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And thanks to all of you who are joining us today. If you haven't already done so, be sure to log in with your Twitter or Facebook credentials. Click one of the buttons that's around you. You can want to log in so that you can join us in chat and ask all of your amazing questions. You can ask those questions in text or even on video. If you've got a video camera, once you're logged in, you can press camera and we can bring you on screen and you can ask Jon or me any questions that are like really burning a hole in your brain. And before we get started, I also want to let all of you know, in case you haven't seen it, we just announced yesterday a brand new gamification summit, what we call GSummit Global. We're going to be traveling to 13 different cities around the world this winter, bringing gamification workshops, gamification knowledge, new speakers, great live Q&A, an opportunity to meet your local community. We really want to engage folks all over the world in this, including in the United States, the Middle East, Europe, Asia, so on. So if you get a chance, if you're interested in learning more about gamification and earning your certification in gamified design, you can check out gsummit.com and join one of the meetups or sessions near you. Okay, so Jon, let's get into this. Let's dive right in. Okay, you've done so many amazing things. We're going to talk about all these different things that you've done. One of the core contentions that you've made, one of the things that you've said in the past, is that the kind of revolution that we're in the middle of in terms of games, broadening everywhere, gamification, or even the use of social games in business, which was the core topic of your book, Game On. Your contention is that that's been around forever. We've really been doing social games for, I think you've even said, thousands of years. Can you tell us why we've been doing social games all of this time and all of a sudden now we care about them?
Well, that's a good question. I think part of it is that the more recent macro trend is just trying to actually understand the brain and the human mind more recently, and that's of course, it's always been a part of modern science, but really this broad set of neuroscientists and psychologists and behavioral economists, all these people who are trying to understand exactly what the mind is doing, that's kind of been a much bigger trend recently. And I think within that, it's trying to use that kind of knowledge to understand, well, what is it about these games that have worked? Because we've had games for a long time, but people haven't necessarily had a great deal of knowledge about either what makes a game work or why they're popular or why a game like, say, Othello can last for thousands of years of history and keep on going and going. So I think the way I approach these problems is to try to look at the mind and the brain first and how we relate to products and how we relate to things like stories and things in our everyday life, how we use that to communicate with other people and help people understand how to do things better. And then within that, if you really look at games, games are this really interesting microcosm of everything that works great within the human mind, be it reward systems, communications, stories, processes for getting things done, establishing goals and meeting the goals. And then if you can really understand how those games work, you can apply it to things such as your own business and anything in your life, really, which I think is what makes games and gamification really interesting.
So as somebody who's been, making games basically, for as long as, many of us have been alive, what what do you think is the cause of game designers like yourself suddenly being at the vanguard of the human mind? I mean, you're kind of drawing a connection that I think 10 years ago we wouldn't have really drawn. We would have said, oh, well, game design, game concepts, gamification, those things would be, entertainment products, and those people are good storytellers. What is it about this, like now all of a sudden you got to be an expert in neuroscience and the way the human brain works? Why is this?
Well, first of all, I don't think you have to be an expert in neuroscience, and certainly most great game designers are not. I think most of them have approached it intuitively, and there's a certain amount of both intuition and luck that has made particular games really successful and popular out there. Now, I think if you look at it statistically, it's something like 1 out of 5 game products is able to recoup the investment in even making the game, which is that's not the greatest statistic for a startup. I think, though, that the better you understand products and how people relate to it, the better you understand the human mind, the better you can kind of mitigate some of those risks that exist in a game development effort or in a gamification effort for that matter.
So
Why now? I think that more that game, the medium for games, although you can play a game like a board game, um, where you could go and participate in sports or whatever, that through all history has been sort of space and time limited. You have to find someone who you can sit down with and play a game at that particular time with you in a given place. So that alignment of time and space through much of history has, I think, to some extent limited how much games can permeate your everyday life. Whereas now, with the emergence of technology and the internet and social networks, you now have this natural medium for delivering games to people wherever they are at whatever time or place that they choose to participate. And you can even have these social aspects now because of the asynchronous nature of, say, social. So that's really changed, and it's just made it a lot bigger, and there's an opportunity to get it in front of a lot of people now.
So this is one really interesting kind of design question, just to dive in on that for 1 second, that a lot of gamification folks are interested in and lots of, companies are interested in. Um, Asynchronous versus synchronous. So one thing that you see a lot of, especially when you talk to marketers looking to bring, game concepts in marketing programs, they really want, they often have these ideas that are very synchronous. Like, you know what, you go get a team of people and get together and travel around the city and do a scavenger hunt that's branded with our stuff. And I often have to spend time with them explaining, like, hey, a synchronous project, though it sounds much more powerful, is actually really hard for people to do. How do you balance off synchronous versus asynchronous, real time versus non real time, and team versus individual stuff when you're designing? Because isn't this something that's always a kind of tension in the design of the things that you do?
Yeah, so first of all, there's a place for both synchronous and asynchronous, and almost any game can have the elements of both. And if you thought of this, what we're doing right now is a synchronous event, but it'll live on asynchronously as well because people will be able to access the video and the transcript later and find out
Right.
what we talked about. So I think it's important to think about how you can have both work together. Synchronous stuff, the biggest ultimate problem with it is if you're just synchronous, that's very, very difficult to scale because it requires everyone to participate at a particular time and potentially at a particular place. And that just means that you're going to be very limited in the number of people who can participate. And even if you can get it pretty big, you're going to want to repeat it again if it was successful. And it's always pretty labor intensive and difficult to make something happen over and over and over again. So you take a game like ours, for example. So we've created a game called Game of Thrones about the TV show, and you can kind of play characters in that world. It's largely asynchronous in that you can place your moves and you can do things within the game universe and then kind of walk away. Other people then can come and make their moves at any given time, and it doesn't really matter what order all these moves are made in. That's the essence of being asynchronous because people can choose how and when they want to participate. At the same time, we have some synchronous pieces too. So when you go in what we call an alliance, which is sort of like a chat room within the game, people can participate in real time or near real time chat with each other. And that's because people also like to coordinate things and have that real communication. And then they'll go and kind of spin out of that and go off doing their own asynchronous things. So I think balancing the two can be really powerful. If someone was gonna ask me, well, I have to make a decision between one or the other, I would say start with the asynchronous stuff first and make sure that works really well. And if you can get to a certain level of audience scale with asynchronous behaviors, then you can start to add in really interesting synchronous stuff.
Yeah, it's something that I've been actually talking about in the chat while there's a little bit of a chat going on here while you were talking about asynchronous versus synchronous. And Ivan's asking about whether or not asynchronous experiences make things feel less exciting because there's a big lag, right? So if we think about something like Draw Something, right, which is a hugely successful way of doing a game like Pictionary, spread out over two people, and its asynchronous nature. I draw something, I leave it up to you to respond back was a big piece of its success, right? But
Mm-hmm.
also damages it over time because there's the possibility that if somebody doesn't reply to you, if you don't get that response back, or you have too many things outstanding because you don't have an outer limit, an upper limit on the number of games that you can run at the same time, that also becomes potentially overwhelming for someone. So how do you, if you're thinking about, let's think about this in more of a gamified context. Let's think about us trying to foster, let's say, mentorship inside an organization. If we were trying to build something like that and we were building an asynchronous experience, how do we make sure that it doesn't just fall off the cliff of boredom or insignificance over time? How would we rein that in?
Well, of course, first of all, everything is different, but I think that you can look at the way some of the really effective communication platforms have done this when they've added a gamified element to the way they present content to users. So I think one really good example is Reddit, for example. So Reddit has elements of user-created content because I can make my own sub areas. It's got a scoring system because I can go and tell people whether I liked their comment or not, which, by the way, on Reddit has absolutely no impact on how Reddit actually rewards you. It's a purely social reward. If you gain points, you feel good about it, but it doesn't actually do, like, you don't win something. You don't suddenly become the Uber user of Reddit because you gain some points. But I think it's done really well in terms of still motivating people. People want to be regarded as a user who posts things that are interesting to other people. So the thing that Reddit does by having this structure around both user-created content and the ability to kind of own realms within Reddit, what they call subreddits, as well as the scoring system, creates this environment where people can identify pieces of content that they want to participate in. It's asynchronous, but in some cases, with a really busy subreddit, it's almost synchronous because the flow of commenting can be really fast.
Right.
But I think that when you're dealing with a lot of information and an overload of information, first of all, by the way, that's a really good problem to have, that the people who are participating are being overwhelmed, because it's really hard to fix underwhelmed, if there's not enough engagement. But overcoming the cold start problem, as you call it in your social networks and games, that's really hard. But once you're at that point of, wow, so many people love this, that they're participating very actively, layering in some tools that help surface the things of most interest to people is a really good way to do it. And the way I think Reddit has done it successfully is essentially by using social status and social recognition as the channel for how to convey that information. And lots of games, I think, do that. If you look at even an MMORPG, the ability to have different chat channels, like guilds. Guilds are essentially, in most games, are actually just a chat channel.
Right, sure.
It's a way for people to work with each other and do interesting things together where it doesn't show you the entire universe of communication, but the universe of people that you want to participate with.
Well, one of the interesting kind of observations you've made, and I know I've made it, which is about how, chat is such a, like, really people in dialogue is such a large engine of a lot of the really successful, like, gamified or game interactions that we've seen. So one question kind of pivoting this a little bit, John, and we're going to come back to talking about your work on Game of Thrones and stuff because I think it's really interesting. So one aspect of this, Pratik is asking, thanks for the question, Pratik, about gamification in education. And I know that, one of the things that we always have to do, and let's talk about both the micro and the macro. One of the core places that you see gamification used often is in onboarding a user to an experience, thinking about how you actually get them to learn what they need to do next, right? And then there's the other kind of bigger question of how do we teach kind of complicated ideas to people? Now, what aspects from your experience do you think are most important when we're thinking about how we might bring game concepts into that into the learning space in general? And I don't want you to necessarily focus like on classroom education as much. Let's just think about teaching people, and especially because you've been very interested in the subject of gamification and the business world. What do we
Yeah.
what do we need to be mindful of as we're using these techniques to train people?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a lot of opinions on gamifying education, and I it's probably one of the best opportunities for it, and probably still remains one of the most underutilized areas where games could have a big payoff. I think the thing that's exciting about games is that games are fundamentally, for most games, about exploring a world in some way. So that goes for whether it's a game like chess or true, virtual world like a World of Warcraft. They're still in some ways about exploring a world, whether it's a world of spaces or a world of certain rules that you kind of discover, and through that process, you're there kind of like a scientist, probing and testing that world and seeing exactly what works and what doesn't. And that's extremely effective as a way to help someone learn something because it mirrors the way we've evolved to do that. So we evolved as organisms to test our environment and figure out what's going on around us through testing and exploration. And it's only really with the advent of language that you start to have this idea of like listening to a lecture or hearing someone speak and explaining how you do something. And humans are really great at that, and it's one of our distinguishing characteristics as a species. But the thing that's much older in our brains is just this idea of exploring. So from a macro standpoint, I think the more you can make education about exploring a space rather than simply kind of dictating a set of information, I think that you're then applying one of the fundamentals of gamification, in my view. Now, I have a different view of gamification than many others do around gamification, but I see gamification largely as about understanding how stories work and exploring spaces and really putting someone into a context where they can learn on their own and take advantage of what's in the brain around information transfer that works really well. So, I think that education needs to increasingly be about allowing people to explore on their own and making sure they know when they've um, explored and discovered something really interesting, because that's how you can kind of close the loop with reward systems and so forth.
So can I just pull a thread on something you said, which is about storytelling, your view on storytelling and gamification? I think this is particularly interesting, John, and something I know that everybody wants to hear. So how important is story? Because sometimes story can, I think, story could get in the way of helping people get where they need to go. But I think in your view, story is this very important element of gamification. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. So, well, I think stories are important for everything we do in life. That's not a panacea. You're not going to make up a story about every single thing because you're going to bog everything down. But in general, we learn much better through a story than we do just through conveyance of information without a story. And that's because, again, evolution. We've evolved to listen to stories, understand stories. It allows us to sympathize with characters and stories and put ourselves in the place of another character. So, a simple way to think about stories is who are the characters in the story? Who is it that you want to convey information to? How are they going to be using products? How are they going to be relating to your business? Think about it from that standpoint, and it may change somewhat how you want to explain things to people and show people how to do things. So without giving away too much, for example, other than Game of Thrones Ascent, which is like 99.9% of my time, and 0.01% of my other time, I'll occasionally advise to some startup companies. So I'm working with a company called O-Power, which is doing really revolutionary stuff to help people decrease their energy usage and save billions and billions and billions of dollars because we use too much energy. And the way I'm helping them look at things there is to think about, the consumer as sort of a hero, but also small businesses even can be heroes if they figure out ways not only to decrease their energy usage, but use that as a way to gain some social status within their communities to show that they're good citizens or good businesses or rank better versus each other. So um, when you start thinking about characters, you start thinking about these deeper parts of the human psyche about social status and rewards. And I don't mean just like rewards like, yay, I just won some points. That can work on a short-term basis, but kind of the enduring things are making people feel like they're part of a community and they're gaining social status. So when the points equals gaining real social status in a community, be it a game or social network or not, that can have a huge impact in helping shape people's behavior in a positive way.
So, well, I think this is interesting. So those things all really resonate with me, but so maybe there's some kind of a gap there on the story front. We've talked a lot about O Power, on gamification.co. I think we've got one link we're going to throw up there just if people want to read more about it. I'm a big fan of O-Power. I think it's really interesting. It helps people a great deal, figure out how they do their power, how to lower their power consumption, help the world. It's all great. But the gamification in O-Power isn't like classic game story because it's not like when you sign up for O-Power, you suddenly are Mario and you have to go discover the princess, right? Which has been chatting about. I've been chatting about that in chat, asking folks have been asking whether or not Mario would have been as successful without the princess as part of the story. So, so what's the finesse there, John, for us to understand? There's story made with a capital S and story with a small s. What's the difference between those things to you?
Well, I think the feature to understand within stories and characters is this idea of aspirations. So giving someone a reward system without giving them something really specific that they're aspiring to, like sort of like what do you want to be when you grow up, or what is the role model that really appeals to you. That's, I think, the story to tell for many of these things, and I include O-Power in that category. So there's exemplars out there that do a great job at, say, energy conservation, and being able to show the player, if we want to use that term, what the winning players are doing and throwing a spotlight on them so that you understand what it is about their behaviors that's positive and what is the route that you can take to get there. I think that's a story. So people understand things a lot better when you give them an example, not of just things you do, but here's a person that you could become, or here's a type of a business that you could become, and help them chart a course there. Now, the course might have badges and all these other things that are the trappings of game design along the way, but the badges exist for a very specific purpose, which is to take them down a journey and with a particular endpoint, a series of endpoints.
So it's kind of like in a way you're saying there's like a story that's this like external story, and then there's the person's own story, right? In a way. So some experiences need to focus on the person's own story, and some of them need to have an external story. There's one example that I'm interested in your thoughts on. I don't know if you've seen it, but Autodesk did this gamification of the trial version of their 3D modeling software, in which they used a kind of where in the world is Carmen Sandiego motif and had you learning different elements of the software by unlocking puzzles. You were kind of following the trail of a challenge in the world. And this helped them a great deal, kind of improve use of the trial and conversion to software and so on. So so that's like using a little bit of game story concept, right? But really, the focus is on getting the user to get to their personal goals, get them to achieve their personal best. Isn't that what's really meaningful in a lot of these cases?
Um, you cut out partway through that, Gabe, so I'll comment on what I think I heard and follow up with the question. So I'm not familiar with Autodesk in particular. They're using game techniques to channel people through essentially a learning experience of the products. So there's sort of an uncanny valley of gamification, not like the uncanny valley of, say, bad computer graphics that don't quite look like. You have cutesy like game reward systems as you navigate a space that don't work in terms of people to move through the journey. I think the most powerful place to begin from isn't so much necessarily embedding things that very much look like the trappings of a game, but apply gamified thinking to the problem that you're trying to solve. So when you think about educating someone, um, and in this particular case, educating them about how to use the product effectively, and you show them there's a journey, and at the end of that journey, you're going to be this type of person that has this set of knowledge that can apply. You really show them what that person's able to do.
Ah, I think we've lost John a little bit there. Hopefully, we'll see him back again in a moment. Um, in the meantime, I think one of the things that I want to say as we were kind of talking there and noticing the comments, Sasha's talking about, hey, John, welcome back. Sasha was just talking in the comments about, this issue of whether or not if an experience is bigger versus an experience is smaller, are there design differences between the two of them? The length of time that you expect somebody to be in that game or gamified experience, I think, would be quite different. And I do think that that's true. One thing that's challenging, Sasha, I would say to you in terms of designing, gamified experiences that are, gamified experiences that are meaningful is we're almost always trying to get a very good long connection to the user. We're trying to build as much longevity into the experience with the user as we possibly can. So, especially in like exactly, Ivan's just echoing this. Do we ever really want to design short-term gamification experiences? I think especially in the enterprise context where we're trying to build, engagement systems for enterprises that focus on their employees over the long term, we certainly want to be building longer term things, and we have to think about those longer term things. And John's point is, I think, very, very well taken. If you're building something that's intended to be longer term, activating the user's own personal story, the thing that moves them forward, is going to produce more sustainable interaction and more sustainable engagement with that user over the long term. I can't imagine, and I think it's obvious, but things with a purely external story, like when we graft a purely fictional story on top of something, over the long term, I think it's obvious that those stories tend to have a like shorter lifespan, right? At some point, you're done reading the book, and it's like, well, that's all there is to say about those particular characters. But if the story's really about you, if you're in the middle of that story, I think it's much less. It doesn't have as much of an end because hey, your life continues, and I think we continue to have that as as an ongoing kind of thing to consider. Um, One of the other questions that is sort of interesting that kind of came up, and Sasha sort of asked this question, is about game designers versus gamification designers. And I know that if we get John back here, I think he's just rebooted, and Doctor, I know that he's going to have an opinion on this. Sasha, I think there's definitely some tension between the kind of classic game designer worldview and the gamification designer worldview that needs to be resolved. My hope is that more gamification techniques kind of make their way into kind of core game design, and that we see more of that view coming to us in the future so that we have better quality. Um, so hopefully that gets us where we need to go. John, do we have you back?
I think so.
Fantastic.
I
So
restarted. Am I here?
yes, you're back. So
Good.
one sort of quick question for you, because we're running out of time, and I just want to I do want to get to the point of I want to talk a little bit more about your other work, but just briefly, Sasha's asking about the tension between game design and gamification design. And some people have started to say, hey, gamification was use a lot of game principles, and originally it was borrowing a lot of game principles, but actually game design skills may get in the way sometimes of gamification, that they're create conflict. Like, for example, over reliance on creating third-party stories is an example of something that might get in the way. Or we see a lot, especially in the education context, game designers who come in trying to help education. Their first thing is, okay, 3D worlds, avatars, all the trappings of kind of the way that you might design a more hardcore game. Can you speak to your view of that issue, whether or not game design is critical for gamification design, and what you think about that tension, if you see any tension there?
Well, I think it's probably true because I think that you need people who are really great product designers is probably the broader skill set that's required. And many people who are game designers do happen to be really great product designers in a broader sense of the world. But for a product designer, gamification, understanding how games work, that's one of the really powerful tools that's in their toolbox. But um, I think it's wrong to think of gamification as a panacea where if you get someone who um, worked on a first-person shooter, now they know everything you need to know about creating a gamified experience in business. I think good product designers understand things like ergonomics and how the mind works and how people relate to products, and they understand simplicity, and they understand all these things that are really important. And then if they understand games, they'll understand a lot about the psychology of motivation. They're going to understand how to build reward systems. They're going to understand story and how story is a servant to the overall thing that you're trying to do. And by the way, even in game companies, that meaning companies that build entertainment games like my company, story, as important as it is a servant to the game design. We don't like take a story and then have the story run the game design. It's the other way around. Story becomes essentially a feature of the way the game works. And for us, it's important to have the story be very authentic to a world that people are already familiar with in a particular case and all that. But it also has to be a game. It has to work as a game, and we put people into it. So it means that certain parts of the story are pieces that we engage with versus others, for example. I think where even traditional entertainment companies go off the rails sometimes is suddenly you get a narrative design department sort of that runs the whole show, and then you're creating features that are servants to the story rather than the other way around.
Totally, and I'm a huge believer in that too. I said that a million times. I have one last question for you. So folks can go to DisruptorBeam.com and find out more about the work that you're doing and follow you on Twitter at JRadoff. But one kind of last question for you, John, just kind of bringing all these sort of things together. So there's increasing sort of drumbeat about this idea that folks who are good in particular games actually have transferable skills in real life. So the player that's especially good, for example, at a racing game might be good at actually driving cars in real life. When you're thinking about designing something, some of the greatest designers of all time have built games that have this kind of anchoring in the real world in some way. How important is that to you? How much do you process that through? And so in a game like Game of Thrones, how much of Game of Thrones, the actual game design, the mechanisms of it, are based on your view of the real world, understanding that it's a story about a fantasy world?
Well, of course, we're trying to teach the world how to backstab each other and be extremely
Yes, I
cunning and
noticed
all
that.
that with our particular game. Actually, it's a feature of our game. But I mean, I think it's definitely true that people that play particularly social games where they're engaging with a lot of people all the time and are dealing with issues of politics and diplomacy and management and whatnot, the skills are definitely transferable. I mean, one of the best slash saddest examples of this is one of the one of the people who was killed in the Libyan consulate disaster that we had a while back. He was working for the State Department as a diplomat, and he was very good at it. People didn't realize that in his other life, he was also a major figure in EVE Online, which is this huge, sprawling, highly political virtual economy space simulator, essentially, in which he was known in that game for being a diplomat there as well and getting whole groups to work with each other. So you have to ask yourself, to what extent is the fact that he was a longtime player of EVE helping him to test and refine some of the skills that he actually applied in his real life and vice versa? It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. My guess is that it worked together, and in some respects, he always had sort of a talent for that sort of thing. But I think it's really interesting to find that two sides of his personal present there. And certainly, if you look at guilds that are successful in MMORPGs like World of Warcraft or some of the really successful alliances in our game, Game of Thrones Ascent, you really have to be an actual manager to run some of these. I mean, we have one alliance in Game of Thrones which has 10,000 members in it. So this is the guy who runs this is essentially the CEO of a 10,000 person company with all these people and different factions within it and trying to keep everybody happy and productive. World of Warcraft guilds don't get that big, but they spend an awful lot of time, even a 20, 30 person group, to make it really successful and to win raid encounters, for example. You have to be a pretty good manager. You have to schedule people. You have to deal with egos. You have to do all this stuff that's real life. So
And clearly that's
I think it's really interesting.
yeah, and clearly those excellent skills at management are something that don't escape you, Jon Radoff, CEO, founder of DisruptorBeam. You can follow John at jradoff.com. Thanks for being with us today, John.
My pleasure, Dave. Thanks for having me.
And for those of you who've been here today, thank you so much for joining us on the Gamification Revolution. Just a quick reminder, check out gsummit.com. Join us on GSummit Global this fall and winter, coming to a city near you with live certification, awesome talks, great Q&A from top experts from around the world. In the meantime, I'm Gabe Zickerman. You can follow me at @gzickerm, and we'll be back with another episode of the Gamification Revolution next week at the same time in the same place. Thanks, everyone. In the meantime, keep having fun.